Yeah, we produced this report called Much More Than Words. I'm not an expert in communication, actually. It was a kind of weird thing that I landed this, where I got an email from Celia Ingham Clark, who may be familiar to many of you. She's a surgeon, and then she went to work for NHS Improvement. My connection with Celia was that we shared a locker at medical school, and I tried to get out of this role chairing this group on spoken communication and patient safety on the grounds that sharing a locker with Celia at medical school wasn't really sufficient qualification. But she said, no, come on, we've talked about this, and we think you'd be good to kind of pull these people together. But actually, I still say that I'm not an expert on communication, and I pulled together, along with various people. Where's Mark? Is Mark here? Mark Juniper, where are you? Oh yeah, there you are. Some people are in this room who were there. We got people from the NHS, we got people from, I got a few academics because they make me feel comfortable because I'm an academic. And we got, we had patients, patient advocates, we had managers, we had all sorts of people on the group. So this is, acknowledging the input of all of them. NHS Improvement pulled it together. They didn't actually fund it. They didn't give us any money. This was all done, well, not just on the shoestring, it was on zero funding. I think we could have claimed our train tickets, that was it. So it wasn't a massive piece of work. Look, the first thing that struck us at the beginning of this was that there's a huge number of clinician-patient interactions, clinician-clinician interactions, 1 million every 36 hours. I don't know where that came from. It's true, maybe it's not. But look, there's a lot, and most of them go really well. What is striking is how things often don't go wrong, because actually as humans we're pretty good communicators. And one of the things the group really wanted to emphasise was communication goes well most of the time. All right. The other thing, the reason why this was spoken communication was that there's been loads of reports on written communication, note-taking, recording, all that kind of, the Medical Protection Society annual thing, you must make sure you write this thing in the notes. There's much less on spoken communication. And we recognised right at the beginning that it wasn't just about transmission of facts, that sort of Morse code model of communication. This was about the social and the emotional dimension. All right, look, you know about communication tools. You know way more than I do. I don't practice as a clinician anymore. My son's an F2 at the moment. He knows about S-bar and all those kind of things. And he likes them because you can kind of memorise them and pass exams about them. But we also know, and I think, just Kathy's last couple of case studies, actually the cock-ups are usually not because you failed to use the S-bar tool. Communication is more complex than that. We wanted to capture that and respond to it in the work that we did. Okay, so we had lots of people from different sectors. We wanted to understand good communication and poor communication in the spoken bit of communication. We got together a whole load of data. This wasn't formal research, but we had things like the National Reporting and Learning System, we had complaints, all that kind of thing. We did a few focus groups, because I'm a qualitative researcher, and we also looked at the literature. It's a bit of a whistle stop, and then we produced this report. Okay, so we were looking at the process of oral communication, mainly between two people, but also in things like surgical teams. And we were looking at communication, not just that wasn't quite right, but which also didn't happen at all. And actually, the previous example of Kathy, the youngster with cerebral palsy went to university, the communication didn't happen. Someone may have picked up the phone, but they didn't, maybe because there wasn't anyone at the other end to talk to. So we did actually look at failure to communicate, but we didn't look at when the spoken communication was okay, but then the person didn't action. All right, look. I won't read this out, but here's an example which I think you probably all spot. Lots of qualities of good spoken communication. And I can't even remember where this came from, but it was one of the examples. I think it was from one of the workshops we held, and someone kind of wrote this down. And you can see here, there's something about the motivation of this consultant. He's also a person that you'd quite like to be working with yourself. Maybe he's got a bit of time, he's respectful, He actually sort of checks whether people understand. He's friendly and open and approachable. The sort of person where if something started to go wrong, you'd feel confident to contact him. Okay, here's a couple of examples of poor communication. I'm giving you these to illustrate the huge diversity and complexity of even a relatively simple communication situation. And I'm sure, you know, those of you who are clinicians, you could give me hundreds of these. They're all very different. These are real, by the way. They're real, and they're in the public domain somewhere. Okay, so you can see how, I mean, I'm a great believer in the study of narrative. You can see how the unfolding story kind of goes slightly wrong at some stage, but you can also see how lots of different things are beginning to contribute to that going wrong. All right, I'm not going to give you huge amounts of detail about what's in the report. I just want to kind of inspire you to go and download it and read it yourselves. Is what I want to do. I'll give you the URL in a minute. You can take a picture of it with your phones if you want. So the 6 themes we looked at, the communication environment, so often in the NHS, and you know this, the ideal communication situation does not exist. You're talking to the patient in a noisy ward, someone's got a radio on this. There are things you can't avoid. Things are stressful, you're busy, your bleep's going off, etc., etc. So that's the sort of physical and wider environment in which communication takes place. Not ideal. There's information exchange, that's pretty obvious. Is someone giving the right amount of information to the right person at the right time, etc. Then there's something called attitude and listening. So much failed spoken communication, some of which led to deaths, was about people being just downright rude or uncaring. And again, I won't labour that point too much. People not being listened to. I myself was unwell a couple of years ago. I was in hospital with what turned out to be neutropenic sepsis, and there was an attitude on ward that I was neurotic and imagining it, and nothing I said got through until the blood cultures came back with the Staph aureus in, and then suddenly it was all different. So I've been there, but failure to listen, to take seriously the patient, or indeed the junior member of staff, is very, very common. Then there's something called aligning and responding. Basically, people, a conversation requires me to take on board what you're saying and adjust what I'm saying in response. If I'm consulting with a patient who's the same age, social class, ethnicity, language background as me, things tend to flow pretty well. If I'm communicating with someone from a different social class, ethnic group, etc., I have to kind of work out now, what is this dialect? What does it mean in that context? And then respond. And the good doctors, the good nurses are really able to adapt and align with the way the conversation is flowing. All sorts of awkwardness happens when that doesn't happen. Creating the preconditions for effective communication within the team is about psychological safety. Some which you may have read about. Amy Edmondson's done a lot of research in this. It's about a bit more than that, but the idea that ideally the most junior member of the team would feel confident in speaking up, and they're not going to get their head bitten off, and then they don't think they're going to get fired. Those preconditions, and that example of good spoken communication that I gave you, that consultant was obviously creating those conditions and modelling those conditions. It doesn't always happen. And finally, we did a section in the report on communicating with specific groups, with children, with people who are limited English speakers, who are deaf or hard of hearing, cognitively impaired, etc., etc. As you can imagine, everything is raised to a power when you have, communication barriers of various kinds. All right. What we concluded was that communication situations are very rarely simple, even when they appear simple. That communication is very much about absorbing what is going on socially, as well as simply the words that are said. This was something actually that NHS Improvement were not expecting from this group. They kind of had a bit of an expectation that we'd just be recommending a different kind of structured communication tool. We said, no, it's a bit more complicated than that. So we called for a new communication paradigm. That's a good one, isn't it? But what it meant was we need to move away from this idea that there is a kind of structured way of communicating and get more focus on the social situation in which words get exchanged or fail to. And so we said, look, training has got to be about the complex real-world situation, which is often imperfect, in which communication happens. That there's often uncertainty, contradictions, all sorts of emotions flying around, which is not the sort of thing that you actually learn about when you're learning your communications OSCE or whatever. And what that means is that people are going to have to be adaptive and flexible and need to be taught and supported to do that. So the key take-home message is this notion of spoken communication as context-dependent social interaction, which is influenced by a whole host of things, and also by the busyness and imperfections of the care environment. We concluded that good communication can't be scripted, and we pulled out 3 tensions. I guess this is the academic in me wanting to kind of do something theoretical. We felt there was a tension that needed to be managed between this ideal communication environment, everybody's got to be quiet, it's got to be relaxed, everyone's got to have all the time in the world, and the actual reality of how conversations happen. That's not a tension that can be resolved. These tensions can never be resolved, actually. We need to handle them. There's also a tension between a narrow definition of good communication, which, as I say, it's a sort of Morse code model, and a more broad definition of communication as a social, emotional, and cultural act, requiring you to kind of have your wits about you and engage emotionally and all that kind of thing. And finally, the tension between the structured and standardized approach versus a much more adaptive approach, recognizing that every communication situation is completely unique and the person's got to be able to respond in a creative way, not a scripted way. And again, sometimes the structured approach is absolutely appropriate and sometimes it's not. So, that's the full report. Take a picture of that, you can look down there. It's not long, we tried to do it in something called a 1-3-25, so there's like a paragraph summarising it, and then there's a 3-page executive summary, and there's 25 pages of main stuff, and then a whole pile of appendixes. So yeah, do download it. We're planning on a next phase, but awkwardly, because it's NHS improvement, I'm not allowed to tell you about that yet. How about that? I think that's the end. Yeah, let's put that one up.